Let's get right into it today because it's World Series time. There's a lot of baseball this weekend, and I know I can't claim too much of your time. For that matter, Shohei Ohtani is about to claim mine. At least I think he is. Maybe he'll do a Gil Hodges or Dave Winfield and have a 1 for 21 or 0 for 20 World Series. That would be depressing, and I say that without rooting for anyone. I'm just rooting for a good show. This week, I got a note from listener Ken, who reminded me, and not just me, but some other fellas in this space, that when I talked about Shohei Ohtani's spectacular NLCS Game 4, 6 scoreless innings, 3 home runs, it was insufficient to say, well, that was unprecedented. Babe Ruth never did that. Or as I believe I said last week, when Reggie Jackson hit 3 home runs in 77, he wasn't also pitching. Ken, and thank you for both listening and writing, also brought up games like Bob Gibson's 1967 World Series Game 7, the clincher, obviously, we don't play 9 games anymore, in which he allowed 2 runs on 3 hits and struck out 10 in a complete game, while also homering off of that year's AL Cy Young Award winner, Jim Lonborg. And the reason it's insufficient to stop there, Ken pointed out, is because we're slighting another great player, a man whose name was Wilbur, but we know him as Bullet, the Negro League's great Bullet Rogan. I really appreciated Ken reminding me of that, because today, more than ever, when a political faction is trying to bleach our history of the contributions of men and women of color, I should not be guilty of doing the same by neglecting incredible players like Rogan. Just saying the foregoing makes me feel incredibly saddened and downhearted because what he and players like him did, and Rogan was very much a foundational player for black baseball, are such a great part of both our baseball and our national story. And what bothers me most of all is that this isn't the first time that he's been left out of the conversation. Some very light background. Briefly, there's some slipperiness to Rogan's birth date, but he came into the world in Oklahoma somewhere in the early 1890s. He was a small guy, only 5'7", but he was very strong, so he could throw very hard and he had the wrists for hitting. He pitched sidearm, which reminds me, especially given the period, a little bit of Walter Johnson. I so love looking at old footage of Johnson's windup. It's so smooth, and you can see how he's generating velocity out of his hip rotation. Rogan was doing something similar, I expect, and he always did it from the stretch, no windup. He threw a palm ball as a changeup and a drop curve, which actually, from some of the descriptions of hitters who batted against him, makes it sound a little sliderish to me, but I might be misreading things, because it does seem to have come in from above and kind of arced into the strike zone, as opposed to slashing in from the side. I read a few descriptions like that too, though. You can find a lot of anecdotes about how Rogan would throw that hard fastball with a hop on it, and then have batters falling out of their shoes, getting out in front of the palm ball. Here's the thing, though. Even though Rogan was born well before Walter Johnson, his professional career didn't get started until after the big trains, in part because there really was nowhere for a black player to go back then if he wanted to be a professional. The Negro National League didn't get started until 1920, when Rogan was already somewhere in the ballpark of 30 years old. He and a number of contemporaries who were there at the league's beginnings had actually spent quite a bit of time in the Army, which had built several all-black units to patrol the West and the imperial outposts like the Philippines. Rogan soldiered a lot and played baseball a lot. It was his military playing, in fact, that got him noticed by the incipient Negro National Leagues, and this came via the offices of baseball zealot Charles Dillon Casey Stengel. I didn't plan this, Ken. You brought this up. I know I talk about the old man a lot, but I've no choice here if we're going to talk about Rogan. Now, this story might have gotten a bit garbled in terms of its chronology over the more than 100 years since it happened. But the basic version of the story was that in the winter of 1919, Casey Stengel, then playing very unhappily as an outfielder for the Pittsburgh Pirates, which at that moment were neither competitive on the field or in the payroll department. What else is new? He was barnstorming through the Southwest and played against a black Army team that was impressive, to say the least. When he returned to his hometown of Kansas City, He told a friend, J.L. Wilkinson, the owner who was starting up the Kansas City Monarchs franchise for the new Negro League, "Hey, have I got some players for you?" And that is how the Monarchs began. The reason I said that the chronology might have gotten a little garbled in the interim is that there's reason to believe that Wilkinson might not have been completely unaware of the existence of Rogan and his teammates at that point. But even if that were true, it doesn't really change the substance of the story, because Casey still did play them, still did give his endorsement, which would have carried some weight. He was known as a very smart baseball guy even then. That's in addition to being known as an eccentric, of course. And so even if his endorsement did not fall on wholly virginal ears, I don't see that it would have done anything less than enhance Wilkinson's interest. Rogan would spend his entire career with the Monarchs, including managing them to a pennant in the late 1920s, although he didn't play in that one because somehow, during some roughhousing with one of his kids, said kid put a needle through his knee. I had a friend, I may have mentioned this before, when my wife was in graduate school, who had a toddler, I believe daughter at the time, who just ran up to him one day while he was watching TV, said, "Hey, Daddy," and shoved a Q-tip through his eardrum. I can still imagine what his screams must have sounded like. Here's how Baseball Reference currently sees Rogan's stats. As you know, Negro League stats are always evolving via research. He had a record of 120 and 52 on the mound with a 2.65 ERA, exceptionally strong, 2.4 walks per nine, 5.5 strikeouts per nine, and because he was such a good hitter, he played regularly when he wasn't on the mound and compiled averages of .338 with a .413 on-base percentage and a .521 slugging percentage. In his best season, 1922, he hit .369 with a .453 on-base and a .660 slugging percentage with 15 home runs in 74 games. Again, take these stats with a grain of salt because the records are incomplete and the level of competition was uneven, and yet there's still no reason to think that they aren't representative of Rogan's abilities. Not every Negro League player at the time was putting up those sorts of numbers, particularly not while also serving as a staff ace. In the final game of the 1925 Negro Leagues Championship Series against the St. Louis Stars, Rogan pitched a 7-hit, no-walk shutout with 8 strikeouts in 8 innings. I didn't get to see if the rain came down at that point, but the game only went 8. And he also batted 5th and went 1 for 2, driving in 2 runs. So, yes, Rogan should absolutely be in the picture with Ruth and Ohtani. It's hard for me to know what sort of person Rogan was. It sounds like he was pretty guarded with outsiders, but once he got to know you, he was fine. I don't think there were many or any negative controversies attached to his name. The worst thing I've seen said about him is something that has been applied to many great players, which is that he wasn't necessarily the best manager because the game came so easily to him, it was hard to relate when mere mortal players didn't execute at the level of his expectations. And I wish that it almost were the opposite. I wish that he was not a nice man, because if he were, I would feel a little better about the rest of what I'm about to tell you. In books about the Negro Leagues, such as John Holway's Blackball Stars, there's always a lot of space devoted to whether Rogan or Satchel Paige was the better pitcher. They barely overlapped, so it's hard to know. I'm going to talk about Dodgers star Babe Herman in the second half of the show, but he's also going to show up right here, right now, because Holway talked to him about hitting off of Bullet Rogan. Herman played in the 20s and 30s. Herman said, "He was the best colored pitcher I hit against, had one of the best curveballs I ever saw, and a good live fastball. I always said he was much better than Satchel Paige. Satchel was real fast, but he had a lousy curve, and his fastball was pretty straight. Rogan's fastball was just alive. Did you ever see Luke play? I think Rogan must have learned his curveball from him. Broke straight down. He could field his position good, and he used to hit a few over the fence in that small park they played in Los Angeles." The Luke to which he was referring was neither the disciple nor Skywalker, but Dolph Luque, L-U-Q-U-E, the pitching great for the Reds, of Cuban origin, but of Caucasian complexion. That allowed him to play in the National League, whereas a darker-skinned contemporary such as Cristobal Torriente was restricted to the same circuit that Rogan was. My point in including the Babe Herman quote is that Rogan was not a secret to players who were around back then. Certainly Casey knew about him, obviously Herman did too, And he had a very strong record in off-season games against white players who were barnstorming out west. And just like all the Negro Leagues greats, at various times, Bullet Rogan had to sit there and hear from white players, "Gee, if you were only white, you could really help us this year." Rogan was active in the Negro Leagues until 1938. He played until he was quite elderly in baseball terms. Babe Herman was active both in the majors and the Pacific Coast League until 1945. Casey, of course, was active in baseball until 1965 and was a celebrity in the game until his death 10 years after that. My point is that this knowledge was not in any way obscure. It had not been encased in amber somewhere around 1920. It was pretty recent as of 1947 when baseball partially ended the color line. And yet, it was still so dedicated to the inferiority of black people that they didn't admit any of those former greats who had been shut out of the white majors to the Hall of Fame until the late date of 1971. Even then, they wanted to put them in a sort of side room and say, "Oh, and these guys also played baseball." They'd be damned if they were going to put Oscar Charleston and Cool Papa Bell and the rest on the same wall as Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig because well, just look at them. It was horrible. Satchel Paige, who was going in first, called them on it. This was all defended by Bowie Kuhn, a commissioner at least as tone-deaf as Rob Manfred, but he also had 2 left feet. Eventually, they backed down, and the damned gallery is not segregated. Just think about that. Even if players after the Negro Leaguers were on that wall with the Babe and Lou and so on, they wanted to repeat the insult, the injury that had been done to these men in life, in history, in remembrance. Page said he wasn't a second-class player and he wasn't going to be a second-class Hall of Famer, so you can keep it if you're going to be that way. That was how the people in charge saw America, and many still do. In Hallway's book, which predates all that, predates Satchel Paige being taken into the Hall of Fame as the first Negro Leagues player, Herman went on about the need to induct them. They ought to put some of those guys in the Hall of Fame. I told Casey Stengel, the guys they put in the Hall of Fame are a joke. Rogan's the guy ought to go in. Casey recommended it to the commissioner, but it never took. I don't know when that conversation took place, or even which commissioner Casey spoke with, but I do know that the first Hall of Fame vote took place in 1936, that Casey was inducted in 1965, assuming he didn't speak out before then. Bullet Rogan died in 1967, and some committee gave him a plaque in 1998. He didn't know, he didn't hear, and that honor, quote unquote, did nothing to stir him from the box in which he dwelt for over 20 years. Think he'd have felt something a little stronger if baseball had put aside its traditional prejudices just a little earlier? And why are such prejudices resurgent now? I'll tell you why. Because every chapter of the preceding story takes place in the doom-scarred lands of the infinite inning. Well, hello there, and welcome back to the show. This is the Infinite Inning. I am your host, Stephen Goldman, and if I sound a little excited, it's because the odometer just rolled over. You know, I've never understood that. I was once as a kid in a car with a family friend, and he said, "Look, we're going over 100,000. Look, look, look." And it was like he had spotted an ivory-billed woodpecker for the first time since 1921. I'm just not sentimental about things like that. I don't know why I'm not, but I'm not. I don't see the reason to be. And if you were thinking I was going to say I'm excited because the World Series is about to begin, yes, that too is true. But I was referring to the fact that, according to my records, this is episode 350, a nice round number, worthy of celebration. Now, it isn't exactly 350, and that's because I've thrown in the odd extra episode I didn't number the same way, and we've now had over 20 reissue episodes, which I don't count against the total, but I suppose I do feel some sense of accomplishment, and that reflects the fact that we have been here now together, you and I, since 2017, I believe July. So that number reflects something like 8 years and 3 months work, during which I have told over 700 baseball stories. I should amend that to say I've told other kinds of history as well. Usually both are intertwined, but not every time. I have given you a series of historical fiction takes on players like Lou Gehrig, Babe Ruth, and Broadway Lynn Larry, Joe McCarthy too. I should do a few who aren't Yankees. We've done original songs about baseball during the run of the show. I don't mean to pat myself on the back, but when I look back at that, it's similar to what I feel when I look at my baseball prospectus files. Now, I have been part of baseball prospectus for the majority of the last 22, 23 years, and I have written well over 500 pieces for baseballprospectus.com, not to mention various other ancillary bits and books and things. And I think it turned out to be my life. I still feel very young inside. I'm not young outside. I'm not young in a lot of ways, but I still feel like I'm starting out. I still feel like I'm trying to decide what I want to do when I grow up. But here it is. This is what I did. What does it add up to? I don't know. I don't think it's for me to decide. I go into a lot of used bookstores. I love to find a bargain on an old book. Even more than that, I love to find one that I didn't know about. I've mentioned before that sometimes Stephanie and I have this conversation, and it could be about what we want to have for dinner or what movie we want to watch. And I'll say, I want to watch that one that I like. Which one? Well, you know, the one that we haven't seen yet, but appeals to me in all the ways that I really like things. And I think what I mean is Raiders of the Lost Ark again, just not the Raiders of the Lost Ark that I've seen 98 times since 1982 or whenever it came out. And that doesn't exactly exist. And that's kind of the frustration. What would you like for dinner? You know, that food that I like, but we haven't ordered in a long time. The one that tastes really good and isn't bad for you, and it won't disappoint me because the place that we're going to buy it from is actually good, and we won't just be settling for a change. So that's all kind of futile and not useful, but here's the wonderful thing about the wide, wide world of books. If you go into a well-stocked bookstore, used or new, there's a very strong chance that you will find that book. And maybe you knew about it in advance, and maybe you've never heard about it before, but you pull it off the shelf and you read the back or you read the jacket copy and you say, yes, this is it. Now, I can't promise you that it will be good. I can't promise you that it will meet your every expectation, but it just might. Now, the reason I bring this up is when I go into those stores, I often find books, whether I'm interested in them or not, doesn't matter, that might have been big bestsellers in their day, but are totally forgotten now. And I don't mean totally forgotten in a way that they will eventually be rediscovered because they're that great. No, they're just gone. More likely, they didn't sell at all. It came out for the author on a Tuesday, and that author, he or she or they, was sitting at home and saying, today is the day my life is going to change. No, actually, the box of books landed at each bookstore with a thud. And there they stayed. And there it remained, and there might not have been an encore. So I know that whatever legacy I have isn't up to me, and if someday someone wants to say that I wasted my life writing and talking about a kid's game and doing it in the way that I do, which is to interlink it with the culture and politics and history of America at large, was especially alienating for a large segment of our increasingly reactionary audience, well, so be it. This is the life that I chose, or chose me, a lot of both. Mostly, I guess I chose it. And although it's a cliche to say that the real value was in the friends that we made along the way, it really has been that for me. That I've gotten to talk with you and hear from you and learn from you, as I did from Ken's email this week. That I would never trade for a much more popular or lucrative kind of occupation. So speaking of lucrative, now would be a good time to bring this up. I feel kind of awkward about this. I always do. And if you've been listening for long enough, you know that the last thing I'm interested in doing is a PBS-style pledge drive. Our operators are standing by. This show is supported by a combination of its many loyal Patreon subscribers and the small amount of money that I receive through advertising. Whereas the audience of the Infinite Inning is not large by the standards of Joe Rogan or any of those other top-of-the-list podcasts. It has been both consistently above average, except for a bit of a sag I talked about maybe over a year ago now, which we seem to have gone past. And but for that blip, where I worried that I might have run my course with you, it has been very loyal. Even so, the revenues that the show brings in are not necessarily equivalent to the amount of time it takes to produce the program. And so, going back to day one, this has been a labor of love, but it has also been a battle to make it something more than that in terms of my family. And I say all of this as a kind of prologue to a new kind of advertising I'm going to be experimenting with over the next few weeks, which you may or may not find intrusive. And I urge you to let me know how you feel about it, whether via email or the Facebook group. And it is this, the dreaded live read. You have heard it on other podcasts. Hey folks, go to that website and get 15% off your trust when you mention the show. Well, that's the kind of thing I'm going to try. It's been made available to me by my podcast platform. I'm not supposed to read it like that. Hey folks, it's not supposed to be phony, but I just want to be straight with you. It's a list of about 50 products. I wasn't very happy with most of them. They were not things that I felt like I could recommend to you. But I found a couple that I might actually use myself, and at that point I thought, well, okay, I haven't used them, not yet. Again, not going to lie to you, but I thought we'd experiment and see how this thing goes. Again, if you object, let me know, because you matter more than the few pennies that we might add to this show's bottom line. Now, in addition to companies that pitch themselves by saying, wear hats just like Melania's, a possibility that caused me to swear very loudly and creatively and then be sick for a week, there were a number of purveyors of coffee. And coffee is very important to me. It is, this is sad to say, but true, the best part of every day. I look forward to it when I get to fill my bespoke, oversized coffee mug with the latest Java that we are trying out. We experiment quite a bit with the good stuff, which is a commitment nowadays because, as you know, the wholesale price of coffee is up something like 45% year over year. That's partially due to climate change, a Chinese hoax, I understand. I was told that by one of Melania's hats. And, of course, the tariffs that have been placed on just about everyone who actually produces coffee, because just about no coffee is produced here in the United States. That's why I decided to partner with Afuera Coffee. I hope I got that right. You know me and accents, we don't go well together. Afuera Coffee takes your coffee experience to the next level with their specialty hand-selected beans sourced directly from sustainable certified Rainforest Alliance farms in Central and South America, presently about to be visited by the aircraft carrier Gerald Ford. These are very strange times, but they primarily ship out of El Salvador, which just this one time is not in trouble. Not yet. Their meticulous roasting process brings out the rich, smooth, and aromatic flavors Afuera Coffee is known for. I wouldn't know. I haven't tried it yet. If you try it, you can let me know, and if you do try it, by going to afueracoffee.com, and you type in the code Infinite Inning, you will get 15% off of any product. You're really not supposed to read it that way, but I feel like reading things that way. I've done it so many times, including for the Herculex body battery. I feel like phony old radio callbacks are really part of my shtick. That said, I'd love to do these as diegetic ads. You know what I mean by that? Ads that are actually part of the story. There was, for seemingly 100 years, a great old radio sitcom called Fibber, McGee, and Molly. Fibber and Molly were husband and wife on the show. They were played by a real husband and wife. And a couple of times an episode, the announcer, Harlow Wilcox, would intrude on the action. Fibber would be mumbling to himself, "I can't believe that Gildersleeve stole my stamp collection." And Wilcox would say, "Gee, Mr. McGee, you sure seem down in the dumps." He'd say, "Yeah, I lost my stamp collection." And Harlow would say, "I know what'll cheer you up. A good wax of your floor with Johnson Wax." And to the show's credit, I think Fibber was generally like, "Would you get the hell out of here with that?" But it was all part of the gag as opposed to being intrusive. We'll be right back after this message from Ovaltine. See, that's interrupting the action. Whereas you just stayed in the world of Wistful Vista, where Fibber and Molly made their homes. I'll tell you a fun thing to look out for if you listen to that show. One of the characters was played by Arthur Q. Bryan. Now, we tend to think of all the Looney Tunes voices as having been done by Mel Blanc. Well, many of them were, And eventually, so was Elmer Fudd, because Arthur Q. Bryan kicked off after a certain amount of time. But he was the actor who originally voiced the character. Before that point, obviously, he was not doing Fibber McGee from Beyond the Grave. He was on the show, and he sounds, well, exactly like himself, which is to say, exactly like Elmer J. Fudd. So we got our first ad in, and hopefully next time I won't take like 10 minutes doing it. How do you feel about that? Very briefly, this week at Baseball Prospectus, I wrote about the possibility of labor strife at World Series time next year, overhanging this year's postseason like a vampire. The day after I wrote that, my good friend and occasional guest here, Mark Normandin, wrote about the owner's desire for a cap and how it really shouldn't drive the negotiations this time around. I'm not so sure about that, but Mark generally knows his apples. So if that kind of subject matter intrigues you, then you've got two-barreled, double-fisted action. Or is that double-barreled, two-fisted action? However you like it. It's the Titanic team-up that you demanded. See what I mean about this being part of my shtick? When someone tells you that a salary cap is necessary for baseball to improve competitive balance, tell them that they're full of it. And we can unpack that, if you want, another time, but just the basic math does not work. And primarily what it will do is lop the top off of teams like the Dodgers and the Yankees, not so that they're suddenly having to scrap for good players, but so that ownership can pocket more dough. It will not change that much for teams like the Pirates. They're not going to suddenly become competitive. Now, if the owners simultaneously started sharing a lot more revenue, then that might be the case. But as it is right now, any reasonable salary floor is not being met by teams like the Pirates. In any reasonable cap situation, they would have to add salary. But the thing is, they're not spending that much because they supposedly can't afford to. So without increased revenue sharing, that would seem to be a recipe for going broke, unless they've been dishonest about that. You don't think. All right, well, we'll put a pin in that for now. The World Series doth approach, and I would like to let class go early. The World Series doth approach pursued by a bear. Little Shakespeare for you. Very bad Shakespeare. So let us not tarry, let us not dally, but rather move on to the second act of the show just after this onrushing break. This story suggested itself to me based on something that happened in the first game of this year's NLCS between the Dodgers and Brewers. I've already mentioned the main character. I wonder if, when it happened, you thought of this too. You can let me know about that as well, and you don't even have to include a coupon code. Back in the first game of this year's NLCS National League Championship Series, for those of you who came in late, the Dodgers hit into one of the stranger double plays in postseason history, if not baseball history in general. Oddly enough, though, it had an antecedent in team history. As I said before the break, I bet some of you have already guessed where I'm going with this. Because in our current insane epoch, time feels like a 33 played at 45, a brief refresher. It was the fourth inning of Game 1. There was one out. The bases were loaded, and Max Muncy was at the plate against Quinn Priester. Muncy hit a fly ball to deep center field. Brewers center fielder Sal Frelick got back to the wall, made a leaping attempt at a catch, but while his mitt and the ball did come together for a brief moment, the ball bounced out and hit the top of the wall. So live ball, in play, not a grand slam, but not an out. This was unclear to just about everyone involved. Frelick caught the ball in the air, but off the wall. He later said it was just kind of hovering there. If he had caught it off of his mitt, it would have been an out, but no, it had made contact with something other than him before being caught, so it was still a live ball. The umpire did signal no catch, but the base runners were a little too harried to pick up on that. The runner on third, Teoscar Hernandez, didn't know if he should tag up, just run, stay put, dig a hole, and, well, never come out again. The Brewers threw the ball to the plate, where catcher William Contreras was hip to what was going on, and he stepped on the plate for a force out, one down. He then jogged the ball over to third base and stepped on that bag for the second force out, this one on Will Smith, who should have advanced from second after the ball had hit the wall. If he had known, if he had understood that the ball had hit the wall. Inning over, Score that a 400-foot ground ball double play, 8-6-2. Although it wasn't that simple, it took quite a bit of discussion before everyone had understood what had happened. It's never a bad thing when a play, in particular in a postseason game, inspires one to discuss Floyd Caves Herman, one of baseball's other Babes, lesser Babes, we might call them. He was probably, though, the second best Babe. There was Babe Ruth, then a big gap, and then the number 2 was Babe Herman. Or maybe the great Pirates control pitcher Babe Adams, who we've spoken about a lot on this show, was second and Herman was third. Babe Phelps was a platoon catcher who could really hit, but was very eccentric. They called him the grounded blimp for a reason, and of course he was not necessarily in the best of shape either, hence the second part of that appellation. Babe Young drove in 100 runs twice for the Giants in the 40s, but the war stopped him just when he was getting going. Babe Borton and Babe Dahlgren are remembered mainly because they were linked with the Yankees, the former being one of the 2 players acquired for Hal Chase, the latter for taking Lou Gehrig's spot in the lineup in 1939 when Lou was too ill to go on. I guess Babe Borton is also kind of remembered for getting himself banned from the Pacific Coast League for game fixing, just before the Black Sox affair went into full public crisis mode. Chase was involved with that too, and if life were literature, then it would have been foreshadowing. A couple of episodes back, when we discussed the passing of Mike Greenwell, I remembered that in his book about the Hall of Fame, Bill James responded to, someone who advocated for Babe Herman to be in the Hall of Fame by saying that he didn't deserve to be in for his little Mike Greenwell kind of career. By that, I take it that he meant that Herman had just a few notable seasons during a relatively brief career. The first part isn't really accurate. Herman was much more consistent at his best than Greenwell because the chronic injuries that truncated both of their careers didn't get him until later than they struck Greenwell. Greenwell seems to have started suffering pretty much right away in his early 20s, not that long after he reached the majors, whereas Herman at least got in a pretty complete shot at being in his 20s and maintaining his health and athleticism for at least that long. What they do have in common is that both of their 30s were just one long trudge. Herman was a career .324, .383, .532 hitter for a 1,500-game career. That began in the majors in 1926 and ended in 1945, although there's an 8-year gap there at the end. He didn't play often enough after his peak to have a true decline phase, so that leaves us with averages that are stronger than they otherwise would have been, but it hurts his counting stats. He had fewer than 2,000 hits, didn't make it to 200 home runs, didn't score 1,000 runs or drive in 1,000, although he was just 3 RBIs short in the latter category. There's a good response to that, which is who cares? But I'm not going to give you my Hall of Fame screed for the 180th time in 350 episodes. If you've heard more than 2 of these, you've probably come across it. One thing that I have learned doing this show is that for every player who has a long and successful career with a sustained peak going into his late 30s, there are at least 2 who turn 30 and it's like a gate slams down. After Herman's major league career was over, he went to the minors and played another 8 years before briefly making it back, as I alluded to just a few minutes ago. That was due to the war. He never did stop hitting, but he couldn't play more than a couple of times a week. Maybe if the majors had had a designated hitter back then, he might have lasted a little longer in the big leagues, but I'm not sure of even that because it just seems like he was really debilitated. When we look at Herman, as we have to with most players or all players from his time, is that we have to separate his seasons from their environment. He played in the high-scoring 20s and 30s in a small park, in a segregated league. So you look at his biggest offensive season, 1930, when he hit .393, .455, .678, and all those caveats have to be applied. Now, there's nothing fake about that season. It's real. It's just also not one of the top 300 or so best hitting seasons in modern baseball history, even if the numbers wow you at first glance, because the floor was so high. You have to start with the fact that the average hitter hit 300 and then apply all the other factors that I just mentioned, and it starts to shrink on you. And this is true not just of his 1930 season, but most of them, is that his baseball card is almost completely absent of black ink, despite these averages, which today would be very gaudy. Just to be super clear about this, if your favorite player just had the 301st best offensive season in modern baseball history, he had a terrific year. That's the kind of season that in most years will get that guy an MVP award. But 1930 was such a crazy year that Herman finished 5th in the National League behind Hack Wilson, Frankie Frisch, Bill Terry, and Chuck Klein. Sometimes I hear my inflections when I do this show, and I think that they're all based on John Cleese in Monty Python's Architect sketch. Just dial up one of their several versions of it and listen to the way he intones the phrase, "pass the rotating knives." Maybe it's just a coincidence, but that's precisely the way I just said, "and Chuck Klein." Then again, Klein's stats are even more inflated than Babe Herman, so there might be something subconscious happening when I say his name, as if I'm pronouncing a punchline where the humor derives from the very serious way that we speak some absurd and shocking words. Thus does the conveyor belt carry Chuck Klein past the rotating knives. Now, we're not yet done because we must, to accurately describe Babe Herman, shrink him yet further because we haven't accounted for bad fielding and weird base running. Now, the writers tried to make it sound over the years like he dropped a ball in every game or ran into the wall every time, and that's just not true. That said, some of his adventures, shall we call them, in both departments are pretty ridiculous. He went through the minors as a first baseman, but when he got to the majors, it was like he was a stranger to the position. He certainly wasn't the only first baseman who couldn't throw. I loved to watch Frank Thomas hit, but I tended to cringe. I really had to avert my eyes whenever he had to attempt something like a 3-6-3 double play. Herman couldn't do that either. It mattered more in his time, when bunts were a big part of the game. He just couldn't make the throw from the grass to second base. Dodgers manager Wilbert Robinson, Uncle Robbie, once he had seen Herman screw up enough of these plays, told the pitchers that on any bunt play, they had to beat Herman to the ball, just hustle over there and grab it before he can. That's a quote. They couldn't do it, in part because he was actually quick. So Uncle Robbie, no doubt doing some sort of old slapstick comedy, red in the face, grabbing his hat and crushing it in his hands and going, "Arr," took Herman aside and gave him new programming. If we're in a bunt situation and the bunt comes to you, don't attempt a play at second base no matter what. Do you understand? Yeah, I understand. Never, not at all. But he couldn't remember. He just didn't think that quickly. His instincts took over, and he kept trying to make the play. And that's how he wound up in the outfield, where, columnist Westbrook Pegler said in his pre-insanity phase, they called him the self-defense outfielder. He began to catch fly balls just so they wouldn't hit him in the head. Herman always denied that fly balls had hit him in the head. Maybe a few bounced off his shoulders, but never the head. It's a good line. And then there was the base running. John Kieran, the great New York Times columnist, wrote, "It is respectfully suggested that as soon as the yachting series is over, the Brenton Reef light be removed from its rocky base off Newport and erected at first base on the Brooklyn Diamond. Ordinarily, it could be left dark, but when Herman gets on the bases, the great light should be turned on, and the lighthouse keeper and his whole family should get busy and polish the mirror and reflectors. It would be a warning that runners in the wake of Babe Herman had reached dangerous territory and should go at half speed, tooting a foghorn every 30 seconds. Kieran wrote that column on an occasion in September 1930 in which shortstop Glenn Wright hit what would have been a home run, but Herman was on base and somehow he stopped to watch it and Wright passed him. Uncle Robbie, I always have to add that Uncle Robbie was an old Oriole, so he knew something about the game from some of the people who kind of created the modern version of it. Besides, he always added it, so why shouldn't I honor his wishes? I like Uncle Robbie. Seriously, as I reported in a prior episode, "I'm an old Oriole" was among the last words he spoke on this planet. In any case, he was not happy on this occasion. He said, "This thing of one runner standing still on the baselines while another runner passing him has got to be stopped." He added, as if his players didn't quite understand the basics of the game, "We can't win ball games that way." By this time, I think Uncle Robbie was an example, and many managers have reached this point, of the great early Elvis Costello line, "I used to be disgusted, but now I try to be amused." As anyone who has ever attempted to cultivate a similar attitude knows, and I feel like there have been many times, particularly recently in our lives, when it was healthier to try to do so. You can attempt it, and you can succeed a lot of the time, but you won't succeed 100% of the time. As Casey said, they say you can't do it, but sometimes it doesn't always work. Recently, there was posted on YouTube some colorized footage of this very Brooklyn team, the 1930 team, opening spring training. And there is sound. You can hear Uncle Robbie speak. I had never heard Uncle Robbie speak. On the page, yes. From his actual living body, no. And what's great about it is that it actually goes to this thesis that I've just given you about his attitude at the time. I mean, he seems to be in a good humor. I think he mostly was. But as camp opens, he's giving the traditional address to the assembled roster, and he says something like, well, I think we've assembled a good team this year, and I think that we are likely, if you fellas put your shoulders to the wheel and really work, to get out of the second division, which we've been in for a while. Too long. The "we can't win ball games that way" play was the second such play Herman had been part of in about a month. The previous one occurred in the top of the first inning at St. Louis on August 11th, 1930, and it mattered too, because Robbie was right. The Dodgers were in first place at the time. They had a decent team that year. After Brooklyn's leadoff man, Johnny Frederick, homered off of Syl Johnson to start the game, third baseman Wally Gilbert doubled, and Babe Herman walked. Wright bunted the runners over, giving a pitcher in trouble a free out, but that's the way they played it back then, unless, of course, you're talking about this year's playoffs, in which case managers, as always, get over-caffeinated and try too hard to make things happen. Put that aside. First baseman Del Bissonette walked, reloading the bases. Al Lopez hit one the other way, lining a single over first baseman Jim Bottomley's head into right field. Gilbert scored easily, but Herman rounded third and stopped as the throw came into Cardinals catcher Jimmy Wilson. Bissonette kept on going and arrived at third to see Herman standing there. "What are you doing here?" Bissonette asked Herman, and Herman replied, "Everybody's got to be someplace." No, that's not true. What happened was that, as Kieran later observed, the bases are one-runner sized, and added occupants are illegal. According to the rules, and this will come up again in a minute, Herman was entitled to the bag because he got there first, and Bissonette was a trespasser. All Herman had to do was wait for Cardinals third baseman Sparky Adams to tag Bissonette with the ball, and the play would have been over, leaving the Dodgers still batting with 2 outs and runners on first and third. But Herman didn't know the rule. He lit out for home, leaving third to Bissonette, and of course he was instantly caught in a rundown. Bissonette, seeing Herman coming back to third, headed back to second instead of holding his ground, even though it was his bag. Wilson, the Cardinals catcher, in case you don't have a scorecard, fired the ball to Cardinals shortstop Charlie Gilbert, who put the tag on Bissonette as he came into second base from the wrong direction. And since Babe Herman had apparently been permanently blasted out of orbit like the moon in the opening credits from Space 1999, he still had time, Gilbert did, to throw the ball back to Wilson, who was there waiting at home plate as Herman came down the line again. Herman did a Tex Avery double take, threw all his gears into reverse, and headed back to third base once again. There's no place like third. There's no place like third. Another rundown ensued, and Herman this time was put out by Sparky Adams to end the inning. The Dodgers scored only 2 runs when they might have scored more, and subsequent errors on defense handed even more runs to the Cardinals. Herman hit a home run later in the game that temporarily restored the lead to the Dodgers, but what was remembered were his mistakes. The Dodgers had lost by 1 run, his run, and by that result, slipped out of first place. The imagination falters at the cruel and unusual punishment that John McGraw or Joe McCarthy would have dealt Herman, Westbrook Pegler wrote. But it seems that Uncle Wilbert likes him goofy and only remarked that the boys were running true to form. I know I've said it before, but I hate quoting Westbrook Pegler. I'll remind you why on the other side of this break. Maybe I'll pause for a second to take him down, pardon the expression, a peg or two. But again, that's right after this brief intermission. So forgive me if I'm repeating information I've given you too many times before, but you know how I love the great old newspaper columnists of yesteryear, and I quote them here whenever I can. They wrote so colorfully, well, the best of them. You just heard me cite the great John Kieran, the writer and naturalist, and a guy who seemingly had memorized all of Shakespeare. If you want to hear him prove it, just dial up any old episode of Information Please. Unfortunately, there are only 3 years. I've mentioned this before. It ran for like 10, but they only recorded the first 3. And I remain heartbroken that those radio waves just went out into space somewhere. And if you're listening to me out by Sirius or Alpha Centauri or something, and you happen to catch those waves drifting by, could you bring them in for me? Just reel them in, record them, and then send them some kind of information energy packet out this way. I'm sure SETI will pick it up. Unless Doge has turned off all of those antennas pointed towards space, all those satellite dishes that, oh, they're just dead now, you say. Ah, great. Wonderful. Swell. Actually, that's a good mode in which to discuss Westbrook Pegler for just a second. As I've said before, he started out writing reasonably intelligently and entertainingly about sports. But over the course of a roughly half-century career, he drifted dramatically rightward. Radicalized by the New Deal, he became a full-on reactionary. Everyone was a commie. I think the last time I mentioned him, I gave you some of a parody of his stuff from The New Yorker, in which he revealed Santa Claus to secretly be Comrade Jellybelly. Here's one from Mad Magazine in 1957. I'd say who the writer was, but they didn't credit him unless I missed it somewhere. But the springboard for this story was that they took a Jejune news article, I suppose it was a real thing, I don't actually know, and then imagined how various publications would respond to it. One of them was Pegler. The actual news hook was, Billy Poobah, son of Mr. and Mrs. Jim Poobah, took a bicycle ride yesterday, but imagine his surprise when he returned home to find his father waiting for him with a hairbrush. It seems that the bike Billy took for a ride wasn't his. It belonged to the little boy next door. So here's the Pegler version, under his usual column name as Pegler Sees It. A delinquent chip off the old blockhead, by Westbrook Pegler. I see they finally caught up with this guy, this Billy What's-His-Name, this Poobah whack out in Kansas. But what doesn't surprise me, and shouldn't surprise anybody who got out of the 6th grade on his own hook and has half a brain for what's going on and isn't a bunch of dopes, is that it's the same Poobah character whose old man was a charter member of the Roosevelt-Truman-Juan Perón Falange that carried the citizens of Abilene along with their votes in its hip pocket for so long. And it's the same Poobah, the old man this time, who's under cover of being a janitor in one of those egghead high schools, carried waste baskets for years in one hand and his party membership card in the other, and you know what I think of Eleanor Roosevelt. Before janitor, this slob was a patrol leader in Boy Scout Troop 18, the notorious commie front group I exposed last Christmas Eve. It was his old lady who used to bake cookies for the Salvation Army's Send a Boy to Camp movement, alias the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. The same summer camp, you recall, which brought together such commie-loving cronies as you know what I think of Eleanor Roosevelt. It stinks. The whole thing stinks. You stink. That's up there with some of the best work that Mad ever did, and kids, nothing ever changes. Some of it sounds familiar, doesn't it? Heck, if you want to go back to 2016 or so, and who doesn't? You could just copy-paste in Hillary Clinton over Eleanor Roosevelt. You know what I think of Hillary Clinton. Back to the Brooklyn Babe. This play, the one I'm about to describe, from 1926, his rookie year, anticipated the improbable Muncy drive in LCS, how about LCT, landing craft tank, on to Normandy Beach, NLCS, Game 1. But as with Muncy, whatever happened after wasn't Floyd's fault. Well, mostly not. The game, which would be remembered for years, took place on August 15th, 1926. Braves at Dodgers, which is to say that from our perspective, it's a total anachronism. Boston at Brooklyn. Neither team was going anywhere. The matchup was Johnny Wirtz for the Braves versus Dazzy Vance. The Braves didn't bring too many players you might have heard of, though future Hall of Famer Dave Bancroft, Beauty Bancroft, was managing. Bancroft did play that year, and he played well, hit .311 with a .399 on-base percentage in 127 games, and I assume his usual grand defense. That was his last big year. It just happens he didn't play in this game. I should also mention that I wrote up another player they had in their lineup, number 5 hitter Glass Arm Eddie Brown, as one of the 100 player biographies contained in Baseball's Brief Lives, the Infinite Inning book. Order now, the holidays are fast approaching. It's not that I'm selling all the time, it's just that I want my work to be read, and I'd like to do another one of those. On the Dodgers side, I should have mentioned Vance was one of the all-time great strikeout pitchers and was headed for the Hall of Fame himself. That Babe Herman batted third. The manager I've already mentioned was the hall-bound Uncle Robbie, and if you want to titter in an adolescent boy way, the cleanup hitter was right fielder Dick Cox. Cox had spurts of hitting on occasion. I'm so sorry. Cox was a decent hitter. He was one of the many minor league journeymen that the Dodgers were very good at unearthing in this period, and so in fact, in a way, was Dazzy Vance. You just only get one of those per eternity. So to the bottom of the 7th, there was one out, and the bases were loaded, with catcher Hank DeBerry on third, Dazzy on second, and second baseman Chick Fuster, a stand-in, on first. Herman was up. Bancroft decided to make a very modern pitching change at this point. Herman was a left-handed hitter, so Bancroft brought in veteran southpaw George Mogridge, who might be familiar to you from either early Yankees history or 1924 Washington Senators lore. That's a World Series winning team. I know you study daily. He was a pretty good pitcher, actually, although getting to the end of the line by 1926. Well, Herman doubled off of him. It turned out to be about the worst thing he could have done. Now, there are several different versions of the play-by-play, but what seems to have happened is that Herman pulled a fly ball to the right field wall. Again, Ebbets Field was a small park. Right field wasn't too far away, 301 feet at that time, with an angled 19-foot concrete wall. Later, there'd be a fence added to that wall, which would double the height. I'm not sure, but I don't think it was there at this point. Now, some versions of the story say the ball hit that fence, which of course it couldn't have done if it wasn't there. But it doesn't matter very much to the story. The point, rather, is that the runners had to hold up to see if Braves right fielder Jimmy Welsh would catch the ball. Well, he didn't. Unlike the Dodgers runners last week, these Dodgers did understand that the ball was in play. DeBerry scored from third, practically walked home. Vance advanced to third, but then hesitated, maybe because the ball was coming on from the outfielder, coming in, I should say, and the third base coach was yelling, "Go back! Go back!" Fuster belatedly attempted to go from first to third. As for Herman, he was just running full tilt without thinking much about what was going on in front of him. The cries of "Go back!" were intended for him, or him and Fuster, not for Vance. As the old saying goes, he who hesitates is lost. Welsh's throw, relayed by second baseman Doc Gautreau, was now about to beat Vance to the plate. Seeing this, Vance retreated to the bag. Fuster and Herman kept going as Vance found himself in a rundown. Incredibly, Dazzy, who, if you look at the pictures or even some of the films, doesn't look like the fastest or most agile impala in the zoo, beat the play. He got back to third, and he arrived at the same moment as both Fuster and Herman did. Actually, and this is important, Herman arrived before Fuster. You know the old joke about the Dodgers back then. Say, how's the game going? The Dodgers have 3 men on. Oh yeah? Which base? The Braves just tagged everyone in sight. Ultimately, the umpires decided to rule this way. The bag belonged to Vance because he had gotten there first. Fuster was out for standing on Vance's bag, and Herman was out for passing Fuster. Double play, inning over. For those scoring at home, the play was 9-4-2-5-4. Those are your lucky lottery numbers for today. Best part, besides the fact that this happened in the first place, the run DeBerry scored broke a 1-1 tie. That was the winning run, so none of it mattered. The same thing turned out to be true of the NLCS game that inspired this week's adventure in time travel. The Dodgers won that game as well. So this was the play for which Babe Herman was most famous. It's not so bad, actually. It's not Bill Buckner. Herman didn't love being thought of as dumb, but he has a story you can tell. That's not true with many Hall of Famers. I mean, you can tell a Bobby Wallace story. Heck, I've done it on this show, but it's much more effortful than this. While playing for the Cubs on July 20th, 1933, Herman had a terrific day against the Phillies, going 4 for 5 with 3 home runs, won a grand slam. He drove in 8 runs in total. It's a great game, but like his big 1930 season, it's special without being unique. The 1926 game, though, the 3 men on third game, it comes with an oft-repeated description by the great sports writer John Lardner. He never tripled into a triple play, but he once doubled into a double play, which is the next best thing. If anything, Lardner undersold that. It's not the next best thing, it's the best thing. And so we come to the end of the historic 350th episode. Should you wish to me on social media, you can do so at stephengoldman.bsky.social. You can also write us, by which I mean me, at infiniteinning@gmail.com, and there's still a Facebook group. There are reasons. Go to Facebook, search on Infinite Inning, bang, you're there. And despite my distaste for the enterprise, I am happy to talk with you there or anywhere else. As I mentioned earlier, should you wish to support the show, and I very much hope you do, please visit patreon.com/theinfiniteinning. Gear of a rudimentary kind that I am overdue to update is available at the-infinite-inning.creator-spring.com. Original soundtrack available gratis at casualobservermusic.bandcamp.com. Finally, should you find yourself with the proverbial moment to spare, please go to the podcatcher of your choice and rate, review, and subscribe. If you're watching on YouTube, or listening, I should say, then do hit that like and subscribe button. And if your podcatcher, hell, YouTube, doesn't let you do those things, find one of the few surviving LSTs and refurbish it as a floating dockside restaurant. That should be cheap. Our theme song, which you are hearing now and have been listening to throughout the episode, was a co-composition of myself and Dr. Rick Mooring, who says, "I am exhausted after 350 innings of telling people what's on my mind. I'm a total blank. Plus, you just stole my idea for a floating LST restaurant." More like saved you, Rick. More like saved you. As the old saying goes, the quickest way to turn a large fortune into a small one is to open up a floating LST restaurant. Well, let's hope the World Series goes 7 so the winter stays away for longer. But in the meantime, I'll set to work on the next 350 stories from inside the Infinite Inning.